The Celeran Dominion was not a species prone to fear. They had risen from the depths of their homeworld's crushing oceans, mastered the void, and bent entire civilizations to their will. Their fleets were vast, their technology unmatched. To them, knowledge was power, and power was absolute. Yet, despite their mastery over the known galaxy, there was one rule every Celeran officer followed without question: never scan a human warship. No official decree existed, no law forbade it. Yet every scientist, every strategist, every seasoned commander knew the truth. Those who had tried had either disappeared or returned changed. The records of such incidents were incomplete, fragmented, as if the data itself refused to be kept. The Dominion's highest minds could not explain it, and that terrified them more than anything else. The first known attempt had been centuries ago, when humans were still new to the galactic stage. A Dominion scout ship had intercepted a lone Terran vessel, a crude, early warship by Celeran standards. Curious, they activated a low-level scan, expecting to catalog its primitive design and move on. Moments later, all contact with the scout ship was lost. When another vessel arrived to investigate, they found the ship intact, drifting without damage. The crew, however, was gone. Not dead, not decomposed. Simply gone. Their uniforms lay crumpled where they had once stood, as if they had evaporated into nothingness. More incidents followed, each one stranger than the last. A research vessel suffered complete system failure the moment its scanners locked onto a human battlecruiser. Its crew survived, but they never spoke again. Not a single word, not even under interrogation. A Dominion intelligence officer once managed to retrieve partial scan data from a Terran flagship. When he reviewed the findings, his body seized, his eyes rolled back, and he began whispering in a voice that did not belong to him. He died minutes later. Over time, the warnings spread. The Celeran Dominion did not fear war. They did not fear death, but they feared what they could not understand. And so, without ever needing to issue a formal command, a silent law took hold. Never scan a human warship. No one questioned it. No one challenged it. Until now. Commander Valek sat in his command chair aboard the stealth cruiser Vindicator, his gaze locked on the massive Terran warship in the distance. Horizon's Wrath hung in the void like a silent predator, its hull black against the abyss. He had heard the stories, of course. He had listened to the warnings, but he was not afraid. Fear was the tool of the weak, and he had not risen through the ranks of the Dominion by being weak. The Dominion ruled through knowledge. If there was a mystery in the galaxy, it was their duty to solve it. Valek clenched his fist. The time for superstition was over. "Begin the scan," he ordered. And with that, the last unbroken rule of the Celeran Dominion was shattered. Commander Valek sat tall in his command chair, his frilled crest flaring slightly with satisfaction. The crew of the Vindicator worked with the cold precision expected of Dominion officers, their bioluminescent eyes flickering in the dim glow of the bridge. No hesitation, no fear. The warnings about scanning the human warship were nothing more than ancient superstition, relics of an era when lesser officers had allowed their minds to be ruled by myths. Valek was not like them. He had studied the Dominion's history, read every report, analyzed every record that had survived. The disappearances, the system failures, the unexplained anomalies, they all had logical explanations. Flawed equipment, psychological breakdowns, coincidence. For all their advancements, even the Celerans were not immune to the irrational fears that plagued primitive minds. He would prove it. "Commander, we are within optimal range," reported Science Officer Killith. "Scanning array is primed." "Good," Valek said. "Activate the scan." A soft hum vibrated through the ship as the Vindicator's powerful sensors locked onto Horizon's Wrath. Data streams flooded the displays, lines of coded information scrolling faster than the eye could follow. Valek leaned forward, his anticipation rising. For the first few moments, everything seemed normal. Standard hull composition, thermal signatures consistent with an active warship, Energy readings slightly above normal, but nothing extraordinary. Valek smirked, and then the anomalies began. "Commander, something is wrong." Kelith's voice wavered slightly, the first hint of unease creeping into her usually controlled tone. "The readings are fluctuating." Valek narrowed his eyes. "Clarify." "The mass of the ship is shifting between two separate values. The data says it is both 3 million metric tons and 0. That was impossible. "Recalibrate the sensors," he ordered. "We already did," Kelith said, her bioluminescent markings dimming. "The readings remain unchanged." The bridge grew tense. The energy output of Horizon's Wrath had just jumped, not gradually, but instantly. One moment, it had been within normal parameters. The next, it was emitting power levels that defied every known law of physics. "What in the void?" one of the technicians whispered. The data feeds became worse. The materials composing the ship's hull changed with every passing second. Titanium, exotic alloys, substances that should not exist. Even the internal structure refused to remain stable. Valek's hands clenched into fists. No, this was not magic. This was not some supernatural force. This was a trick, a deception. The humans were trying to scare them away, planting false data into their systems. "Shut down the scanners," he snapped. "Now." Kelith moved to comply, but the scanners would not deactivate. The hum of the scanning array deepened, vibrating through the ship's hull like a living thing. The lights flickered. A static hiss filled the bridge, and then something changed. The data stopped being unreadable nonsense. It stopped fluctuating. Instead, it began writing something. Every screen aboard the Vindicator filled with a single phrase, repeating over and over, in perfect Celeran script. "You should not have done that." A cold silence fell over the bridge. No one moved. No one spoke. Valek's frilled crest lowered slightly as an unnatural chill settled in his chest. For the first time in his career, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake. The hum of the Vindicator's systems deepened, vibrating through the very core of the ship, as if it were alive, reacting to something that should not have been. The crew sat frozen, staring at the now looping message on every screen in the room. "You should not have done that." The words didn't just appear. They felt alive, as though they had been planted directly into their minds. Commander Valek's eyes narrowed, but his confidence remained. "It's just a glitch," he muttered, though the words felt hollow in his throat. He turned to Kelith. "Run a diagnostic. Clean up the signal." Kelith nodded, but her hands shook as she input commands. "It's not responding, Commander." "The system is." Before she could finish, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the bridge into near darkness. The soft glow of the control panels illuminated the crew's tense faces. Every officer could feel it now. Something was wrong. The ship's normal hum had turned into an eerie vibration, the metal groaning as if under immense pressure. Even the air felt heavier, more oppressive. Valek stood and walked over to the nearest console, leaning in to examine the readings himself. The data on Horizon's Wrath still flooded in, but it had changed. The incomprehensible fluctuations had stopped. Now, the readings were so detailed, so precise, they could no longer be dismissed. The energy output wasn't simply higher than normal. It was impossible. "This can't be right," Kelith said, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. "The power readings, they suggest the ship is drawing energy from another dimension." Valek turned sharply to her. "What do you mean, another dimension?" "There are energy signatures here that shouldn't be possible in this plane," Kelith said, her fingers trembling as she ran another scan. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like the ship is pulling energy from." She paused, her face paling. "A place outside the universe." Valek's mind raced. This was no ordinary warship. But the crew had seen no evidence of human technological supremacy in their previous encounters. Terran ships were crude by Celeran standards. Powerful, yes, but the idea that they could manipulate reality itself was absurd. Shut it down, Valek snapped. Do whatever it takes. But when Killith tried to force the system to comply, nothing happened. The Vindicator seemed to ignore every command. It wasn't just the scanning array. It was the entire ship. Systems were locking up. Shields, weapons, engines, none of it responded. The ship had become, in that moment, subordinate to something else. "Commander, I can't control anything," Killith said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Valek's eyes flicked back to the Terran warship. Horizon's wrath had not moved. It remained as silent as a stone, its presence somehow heavier now. He had thought it was just an ordinary ship, just another vessel of war. But this was something far greater than any Celeran could have imagined. A cold realization settled over him. It was as though the ship itself knew they were there, and it had allowed them to look, to pry into its depths. But for what? What did it want? What was it preparing to do? Then the hum increased again, this time, sharp and painful, vibrating through the bones of every officer aboard the Vindicator. The systems screamed in protest. They were no longer simply malfunctioning. The ship was being tested, and it was failing. A voice, low, deep, and somehow inside their minds, whispered through the ship's speakers, as though it came from the heart of Horizon's wrath itself. "You have seen too much." Valek's pulse quickened. This was no glitch. This was no accident. And for the first time in his life, he feared the unknown. The words echoed in the minds of the Vindicator's crew. "You have seen too much." The voice, not coming through any speaker or transmitter, but directly into their thoughts, sent chills down Valek's spine. His eyes darted to the crew, each officer frozen, their faces pale. No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time, they were no longer in control. Valek clenched his fists, his mind racing. This was impossible. No technology, no being, should be able to manipulate them like this. It was as though Horizon's wrath had become more than just a ship. It was a presence, an entity that was aware of every eye upon it, every mind that sought to peer into its depths. The scans, the readings, had not been simply disrupted. They had been warped. And now, the entire crew was trapped in its orbit, unable to escape, unable to understand. "Report," Valek commanded, his voice tight with authority. Killith's fingers hovered over the console, shaking. I don't understand, Commander. The data, it's completely corrupt." Her voice was thin, trembling, barely a whisper. "But there's more." She swallowed hard. "It's like the ship is reconstructing itself. The readings are constantly shifting, and some of the information, it's not even possible." The technician closest to the rear of the bridge, Lieutenant Threll, jumped from his station and staggered forward. "Sir, you need to see this." Valek stalked toward him, his heart pounding. The screen before Threll was filled with incomprehensible symbols and graphs, but one particular section caught Valek's attention. A string of data, seemingly irrelevant at first, caught his eye. It was an array of numbers, a series of coordinates that didn't align with anything on known star maps. Yet they seemed to pulse, shifting slightly, as though they were alive. "I've cross-checked it with every database we have," Threll said, his voice low. "It's not in any known system. These coordinates, this data, doesn't belong here. In fact, it doesn't even belong to this dimension." Valek's gaze snapped back to the screen. For a moment, his mind could not process the implications. He had seen many impossible things in his career. The Dominion had discovered strange and unexplainable phenomena before. But this, it wasn't a natural anomaly. The data seemed like it was coming from somewhere else, somewhere outside of the universe itself. "This can't be happening," Killith murmured. "This is beyond anything we've ever encountered." Valek grabbed her by the shoulder, his grip tightening. "What do you mean by outside the universe?" Killith swallowed, her face pale. I can't explain it. It's like The data is coming from a place that isn't supposed to exist. A space beyond space, a reality that doesn't follow the same laws of physics, time, or even matter. She met his gaze, her eyes wide with fear. It's like the ship is that place. Valak's mind raced. The implications were impossible. No species, not even the Celerans, could comprehend the existence of a space beyond the known dimensions of reality. How could a human warship, primitive and crude as it seemed, possibly access such power? How could they? How could anyone? Break the very fabric of existence itself. "Shut the scan down, Kelith," Valak ordered, but his voice trembled more than he wanted to admit. "I can't, Commander," she replied. The ship won't let me." The hum from the ship's systems grew louder, reverberating deep within the Vindicator's bones. The ship was alive in a way no Celeran technology could ever be. They weren't just dealing with a warship. They were dealing with something that existed beyond their understanding, something that had consciousness, something that could and would punish them for their curiosity. And that knowledge, Valak realized, was far worse than anything he could have ever imagined. The hum deepened, resonating through the hull of the Vindicator like the growl of some ancient, slumbering beast. The air on the bridge grew thick with an oppressive weight, pressing down on every officer. It was no longer just a ship's systems malfunctioning. Something was watching them. The tension in the air was so heavy, it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. Commander Valak's chest tightened. The data on Horizon's Wrath had become an incomprehensible nightmare, twisting and shifting like a living organism. The readings were no longer just impossibilities. They were unfathomable, beyond anything the Dominion had ever seen. And now, it wasn't just the ship that seemed to be alive. It was as though Horizon's Wrath had become a presence, a conscious being that was aware of their every move. The bridge was silent, save for the soft crackling of static from the consoles. The crew exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared speak. The words from earlier, "You have seen too much," echoed in their minds, a constant reminder that whatever they were experiencing now, it was a consequence they couldn't escape. Then, without warning, the voice came again. "You are not welcome here." The words filled the bridge, not spoken by any mouth, but by the ship itself, seeping into their very souls. Every officer on the bridge froze as the voice reverberated through their minds. It wasn't loud, but it was omnipresent, a cold whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. The presence was so powerful that it felt like it was pressing against their skulls, as if their very thoughts were being squeezed. "Commander," Kelith whispered, her voice trembling. I think it's inside us." Valak swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never felt anything like this. The calm certainty he had once held in his mind now seemed fragile, like glass ready to shatter. He was no longer in control of the situation. Horizon's Wrath had become more than a ship. It had become an entity, a force that was willing to let them observe, but only under its terms. And now, those terms were clear. They were trespassers. "Get us out of here," Valak ordered, his voice hoarse. His eyes were wild, searching for any possible escape. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, but they, too, seemed paralyzed by an unseen force. No one moved. The ship didn't respond to his commands. The Vindicator felt like it had become a part of the Horizon's Wrath, bound by some force that none of them understood. "We can't," Kelith replied, her voice cracking. "The systems are locked. Everything is locked." The ship vibrated again, and this time it wasn't the hum of malfunctioning equipment. It felt like a warning, a tremor deep in the bones of the Vindicator, as if the very fabric of reality was being tested. The lights flickered and dimmed, leaving only the pale glow of the consoles to illuminate the faces of the crew. It was then that Valak noticed something he hadn't before. On the outer edges of the screen, amidst the unreadable data, was a symbol he recognized, but had never seen in person. It was the insignia of the Celeran High Council, but it was distorted, warped, as if it were being pulled apart by an unseen force. The edges flickered and shifted, bending in unnatural ways. For a moment, Valak's heart skipped a beat. He had seen that symbol before, in ancient records, linked to an old myth, one that his people had dismissed as a warning, a mere fable passed down through generations. The myth spoke of an entity that existed beyond the stars, an ancient being that consumed knowledge and twisted it, bending time and reality to its will. A being that could never be questioned, never be understood. Valak's breath caught in his throat. The myth was real. The presence, the ship, was not simply a warship. It was a manifestation of something far older, something that existed before the Celerans had ever mastered space travel. And it was not just watching them. It was judging them. In that instant, the air in the bridge felt even heavier. The walls seemed to close in tighter. The crew's minds began to reel as the cold grip of fear settled over them, and the realization hit harder than any weapon could. They were not just trespassers in the presence of a ship. They were trespassing in the domain of something that should not be. Something that would make sure they never left. The silence on the bridge was deafening. The tension in the air had become so thick, so suffocating, that every breath felt like an intrusion into the ominous stillness. Commander Valak's mind raced, his every instinct screaming for him to do something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The presence that had overtaken the Vindicator was not something he could fight, nor could he outrun it. It was a force of nature, ancient, and beyond understanding. The symbols on the screen, the distorted Celeran insignia, continued to flicker, twisting in impossible shapes, as if mocking their attempts to comprehend it. The message, that same cold warning, "You are not welcome here," repeated itself in their minds, louder now, more insistent. "We need to get out of here," Killith whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the terror that gripped the crew. "Please, we need to leave." But Valak knew that escape was no longer an option. Whatever power controlled the Horizon's wrath, it had shackled them to this moment. The ship had already proven that it could warp reality, twist space, and even manipulate time itself. Nothing they could do would break its hold. His hand hovered over the control panel, but as he reached for it, the systems on the bridge suddenly flickered once more and went dead. The lights, the consoles, the hum of the engines, all of it ceased as if the ship had shut down entirely. The crew members sat in the resulting darkness, their faces illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of the exterior viewports. "We're blind," Threll said, his voice tinged with panic. "We can't even see the Horizon's wrath anymore." Valak's throat tightened as he turned to look out of the viewports. The Terran warship, once so imposing, was gone. In its place was a dark void, empty, cold, and unyielding. He couldn't see the ship, yet he could feel it. The pressure around them was unbearable, as though something was pressing against the very fabric of reality, forcing them to remain in place, suspended in time. And then, a new message appeared on the bridge's central console, breaking the silence. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing. Your kind should have stayed in the dark." The words were not just heard, they were felt. The power behind the voice was immeasurable, something older than stars, more ancient than the foundations of the universe. It was as though the ship itself had reached into their very souls, twisting their emotions and thoughts, causing them to feel the weight of their actions. You knew we would come," Valak murmured, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes were wide as the reality of their situation settled into his bones. "You were waiting for us." The word sent a shiver down his spine. The Terran warship, the Horizon's wrath, wasn't just a vessel. It was a trap, a carefully set snare to lure in those who sought to unravel its secrets. The human race had not simply built a ship, they had forged a gate, a threshold into a place that no one, not even the mighty Celerans, should have dared enter. We didn't know," Killith said, her voice shaking with fear and regret. "We didn't understand. We thought it was just a ship, The voice responded, echoing in their minds once more. You never understand, until it is too late. Valak's mind raced. The legend, the myth of the being that existed beyond the stars, beyond time, was no longer a story. It was alive, breathing through Horizon's wrath. This ship, this weapon of unimaginable power, was not merely a machine. It was an agent of something far greater. And its presence now threatened to consume them all. In that moment, Commander Valak knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the Vindicator and its crew be claimed by this entity, this unknowable force. But as his thoughts swirled with strategies and countermeasures, the ship seemed to react, almost as if it had read his mind. The walls of the bridge began to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. And the message appeared again, this time more urgent. You should not have come. There is no escape. And with that, the bridge lights flickered once more, plunging the crew into a darkness that felt deeper than the black void outside the ship. The message was clear. The Horizon's wrath had made its judgment, and they were trapped in its gaze. The darkness was oppressive. It was no longer just the absence of light, but a palpable force pressing in on the crew. The hum that had once filled the ship was now a distant memory, replaced by an eerie stillness. The Vindicator was completely at the mercy of the presence aboard the Horizon's wrath, a presence that had claimed the very air they breathed, the very space they occupied. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and yet, in some inexplicable way, time itself seemed to bend, slipping between moments, as if the very rules of reality no longer applied. Commander Valak's heart pounded in his chest. His mind was racing, scrambling for a way out of this nightmare. But no solution came. They were trapped. The ship had shut down. The crew was helpless. Even the most advanced technology of the Celerans, an empire that had dominated the stars for millennia, was powerless against this thing that lay dormant within the human warship. For the first time, Valak felt what true helplessness was. The Celerans had conquered entire galaxies, defeated enemies far stronger than themselves. But this was something else. This was beyond their understanding. We're stuck, Killith whispered, her voice raw, trembling with the weight of terror. Her face was pale, eyes wide with the dawning realization of their fate. There's nothing we can do. It's like we're disconnected from everything. The ship, our ship, it's gone. There's no connection, no control. We are nothing. Shut up, Valak snapped, his voice hoarse. Though the words lacked the usual authority, he was trying to maintain control, but the reality of their situation had broken through the shell of bravado he had built over the years. He didn't know what was happening anymore. He didn't understand. There must be something we can do. But as the silence stretched, the crew grew aware of the growing sense of presence in the air, as if something unseen was creeping into the corners of the room, rushing against their minds, sifting through their thoughts. It wasn't a sound they heard. It was a sensation, something deeper, more primal. And then the voice came again, louder this time, as though it had emerged from within them rather than from without. You are insignificant. The words struck Valak like a physical blow. The force behind them felt like a slap across his very soul. The Horizon's wrath was not speaking as a ship or even as a being. It was speaking as a force of nature, an entity that had existed before the stars had formed, before the concept of time itself had taken root. You were warned, the voice continued, its tone cold and implacable. You sought knowledge you were not prepared to handle. And now you must face the consequences of your curiosity. Valak's mind reeled. Consequences. The crew had come here seeking answers, seeking to understand a threat that could no longer be ignored. They had thought they were investigating a ship, an enemy. But they had stumbled upon something far older, something far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. And now it was too late. They were punished for their intrusion. The air around them seemed to grow colder, as though the temperature of the entire ship had dropped by degrees, seeping into their bones, filling them with dread. The lights flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, swirling and shifting like the very essence of fear itself. "No," Killith gasped. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Valak felt a surge of frustration, of desperation. He knew he had to do something. But what could he do against an entity that could twist the very fabric of the universe, that could rewrite reality itself with a thought? The Vindicator was powerless. The crew was helpless. They were not fighting a warship, not battling a physical foe. They were fighting an idea, an ancient, unfathomable force that existed outside of their comprehension. "We must have missed something," Valak muttered, more to himself than to the crew. He was grasping at straws, but there had to be something. Some clue they had overlooked, some way to break free. The voice responded again, its tone carrying an icy certainty. "There is no escape. You are already gone." And as the last of the words reverberated in his mind, Valak understood. They were not merely trapped in space. They were not simply at the mercy of a more advanced force. They were already lost. The moment they had crossed paths with the Horizon's wrath, they had sealed their fate. There was no salvation. There was only the weight of their curiosity, the reckless desire to know, dragging them into the void. The Vindicator was no longer a ship, it was a prison, and there was no one left to save them. The crew of the Vindicator sat in stunned silence, each person trapped within the confines of their own mind, as if their very thoughts had been imprisoned by the malevolent presence aboard the Horizon's wrath. The weight of what had been said, what had been revealed, hung over them like an iron shroud. There was no escape. They were not merely caught in space. They were already lost. Valak sat in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the console, knuckles white. His body felt numb, the weight of despair pressing down on him, pushing the air from his lungs. He had always prided himself on his strength, his resolve in the face of impossible odds. But this was different. There was no fighting this. There was no victory to be claimed. No strategy, no tactics, no weapon, no force that could overcome the unfathomable. He had spent his entire life fighting to protect the Celeran Empire, facing down enemies from across the galaxy. But nothing had prepared him for this. The Horizon's wrath was not a weapon. It was not a machine. It was something else entirely, something ancient, timeless, and beyond comprehension. "You lied to us," Killith whispered, her voice hollow with defeat. "We thought we could control this. We thought we could understand it." But she trailed off, her words unspoken but understood. They had all thought they were in control. They had thought they were the ones seeking answers, but the truth was that the Horizon's wrath had already known everything about them. Their every move, their every thought. They had been anticipated. The voice filled the bridge once more, its words cold and final. "You sought to challenge the unknown. Now you will become part of it." The crew shuddered as the words settled in. They were not going to be killed in the conventional sense. They were going to be erased from existence, their very beings absorbed into the void of knowledge they had dared to touch. Valak felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the ship. It was an overwhelming sense of finality, a fate sealing itself around them. There was no fight left. There were no more options, no way out. They had crossed a threshold, and now they would pay the price for their unquenchable curiosity. "Commander," Threll said, his voice barely audible. What happens now?" Valak opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain the inevitable, the unknowable fate that awaited them? They were beyond hope. They were at the mercy of something that had no concept of mercy. The lights on the bridge flickered again, this time with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundation of the ship. The Vindicator trembled beneath their feet, and for a moment, it felt as though the ship was being torn apart, its very structure unraveling. The presence in the ship grew stronger, more insistent, its cold grasp tightening around their minds. It wasn't just the ship that was alive. It was the universe itself, and they were nothing more than an intrusion. Then the voice spoke again, not to them as individuals, but to them as a whole. This is the end. Your story is over. You have seen what should not be seen, and now you will fade into nothingness. The bridge went black. The cold darkness of space outside the viewports seemed to stretch forever. The hum of the ship, the flicker of lights, the presence of the horizon's wrath, all of it simply ceased to exist. The crew was gone, and the horizon's wrath drifted silently through the void, its ancient purpose fulfilled, its secrets safely guarded. For it was not a ship meant for the curious, nor was it a weapon meant for war. It was a guardian, a keeper of knowledge, a silent sentinel waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek it out. And now it would wait again, for the next curious soul to wander too close, and the cycle would begin anew.